Marketing Vaporware Deathmatch. Blast Processing, Jenny Drive, versus the Power of the Cloud, Xbone. So, yeah, we have these vaporware technologies that do emerge from time to time that cause a great deal of excitement, but generally turn out to be nothing. Blast processing was actually something, though. We've actually got a video on DF Retro about that, but it didn't seem to actually apply to the game that it was marketed with, which was Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Power of the Cloud, that was a fascinating one, wasn't it? Because essentially this was the big Xbox One versus PlayStation 4 face-off. The Power of the Cloud, it was generally established by the time Xbox One was revealed that the PlayStation 4 was going to be more powerful, right? The Power of the Cloud was basically Microsoft saying, whoa, hold on a minute there. We don't necessarily need local compute. We can actually offload it to the cloud. I'm not sure if there was actually any game that actually lived up to that potential, because Crackdown was the big example, and the game that we got was nothing like the demo. So, Alex, where do you stand on this Vaporware deathmatch? And in actual fact, is there any other Vaporware you'd like to bring into the conversation?
Oh, definitely, Rich. Power of the Cloud for me is probably the biggest, I don't know, what do you say, that lead balloon of like all these things, because to me it smelled like BS immediately, and it immediately proved to be BS. I thought it was absolute BS. Blast processing, another thing that I always think about with that system is that it had a more powerful CPU than the Super Famicom, right? Like it was faster, right? So like you could just also argue from that perspective that Sega was also just talking about that CPU limited games on their console could potentially run better or something like that. I have no idea, whatever. So I don't think blast processing is just a marketing phrase, and we've got that good video about maybe what it potentially really was, and it had nothing to do with Sonic. But I still think you could argue that Genesis was faster in some ways than the Super Nintendo, which were meaningful. Though I also kind of want to say like the PS3's cell hype was another one for me where I was like, I just still remember the spec sheets coming out for it versus the Xbox 360, and I saw like three, homogeneous cores on the Xbox 360, and I saw like the original spec sheet, which was like the one PPU 8 SPU, or is it 7 SPU at that point? I forget. My brain is a little bit fuzzy right now. But I just saw all that raw, like no one was saying like what it was, what the rest of the specs were necessarily vis-a-vis other things that you could find, analogs on PC. And I was thinking like, man, Microsoft is toast. I was also like Xbox 1.5 at that point. But then I saw the games come out and I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah. I feel like the Cell in the end was way overhyped, for just essentially being something which nearly every developer used, even the PlayStation ones, to mitigate the bad GPU, which doesn't seem like the intended design almost. It almost feels like a crutched design at some midway point through the generation. So I'll say the Cell for me was a big kind of flop. Hot air.
I've just Googled up John's article on blast processing, and it's basically, I'm just going to quote from it. The basic idea is that the hardware's video processor is blasted continuously, with the 68,000 processor working flat out to change the color of every pixel on an individual basis as the guns on the CRT screen move from left to right and then down to the next line. Mm-hmm. Process known as active scan. The obvious application here is in expanding the Mega Drive's somewhat constrained color palette. But the other thing that the article says is that no game shipped with blast processing whatsoever. It's not to say there weren't lots of really good technical tricks used on the Mega Drive. There were, but not blast processing. But equally, the Power of the Cloud, I'm not sure that ever apply to a shipping game. There was, of course, talk of, I think when Titanfall came out, they were talking about, the servers and what the servers were doing. But ultimately, there was a ton of multiplayer servers out there doing a lot of really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So not exactly the power of the cloud in terms of sort of farmed off physics calculations or lighting calculations, etc., which is kind of what was promised. Oliver, any thoughts on Vaporware or these examples in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that blast processing is perhaps a little bit more legitimate than the power of the cloud, just because, I mean, the CPU in the Genesis there, it is clocked higher. Yeah. But on the SNES, I mean, there were things that you got there as well. I mean, it's not a totally fair comparison because you had like Mode 7 in the SNES. I think the sound chip was better. There were elements of it that were certainly preferable there. On the cloud end of things, I mean, you had that Crackdown multiplayer mode, but I remember being kind of blown away by the demos they had in 2014, and what they ended up shipping in the multiplayer mode was not nearly as impressive in terms of the granularity of that destruction. I mean, the PlayStation 3 would certainly come up with the Cell processor, the power of the Cell. Alex already talked about that, obviously, but those early demos, Killzone Motorstorm, not lived up to in the final releases there, but those were certainly extremely impressive, and obviously the Cell processor ended up not being extremely well suited for game development at that point. But I'd also say Steam machines. I remember being very interested in Steam machines. Those came out, game compatibility was not good, the interface could have been better, but I would highlight that in particular because I think that Valve basically has almost every element lined up for that actually to be a pretty compelling offering at the moment. So that's something that would be great if it came back. So perhaps there's a chance at a bit of a redemption story there.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the PlayStation 3, well, there are a lot of developers out there that look back at it fondly, and I guess there's a lot of developers that look back at it with abject horror. And if you think about some of the stuff that was happening in first-party games, Alex, that the concept that you're going to run post-processing on the CPU and not the GPU would be kind of laughed at these days. The idea that, MLAA, for example, across all of the SPUs there was like 25 milliseconds aggregate processing time on the SPUs. It's just like amazing, isn't it? There's some absolutely fascinating actual vaporwares. If you think back in time, I was thinking back to the Iraqi supercomputer that was built out of PlayStation 2s. That was awesome. I did enjoy the networked PlayStation 3s in Person of Interest by Jonathan Nolan, which was essentially resurrecting a dead sentient AI on a series of networks PlayStation 3s. That was awesome. There's some great vaporware, and do let us know in the comments below of your favourites there. I mean, we could possibly do a video at some point of best vaporware. There was that unlimited detail thing, that Australian developer
yeah,
back in the day. Do you remember that?
I think they're still around. Sorry, Rich, you say back in the day, but I'm pretty sure Unlimited Detail still exists.
Euclidean, wasn't it?
Euclidean, you're quite right, Oliver. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That never made it to a shipping game, as far as I'm aware. But it was it was kind of like remarketed at specific points as being this brand new amazing thing. There's plenty of examples out there. Probably a lot more than we can remember, given that I've just been asked this question out of the blue. But yeah, the Iraqi supercomputer was a particular favourite of mine.